What was the upbringing, highlights, and history of every Spartan II? With 75 Spartan IIs in Class 1, I wanted to talk about each of these Spartans and what their lives were about. Some went on to betray the UNSC, some would try to escape, but then eventually subordinate, some would die in some very unique ways, and even a few are stuck in Covenant cryostasis, nowhere to be found. Some are still out there, and even one is hunting down Master Chief. This video is slammed packed full of juicy lore of hours upon hours of research. So if you guys could real quick smash that like button blue to help boost this video up the YouTube search results, as every like helps support me as a content creator. Thanks so much. Let's jump into it. So obviously I can't cover everything in this video since that would probably be about 20 or 25 hours long. Instead, I've summarized pretty much everything about these Spartans' individual stories and focused on the most interesting aspect of their career, lifetime, and current status, if they're alive or not. Unlike Spartan 3, Spartan 2s were always purposed to live to fight another day, and despite the first batch of Spartan 2s being easily the most powerful Spartans ever created, only a handful, and I mean a small handful, are still alive after the Human Covenant War. And why officially no Spartan has ever been listed as KIA, killed in action, this was simply an Oni protocol to announce all Spartans as MIA instead of KIA for morale boosting. Most of these Spartans have in fact died, and all in very unique and heartbreaking ways, and ways you probably haven't even thought of. So let's first start with the augmentation discharges, aka the washouts, and the ones that didn't make it. So a lot of the original Spartan 2s as children had severe or lethal reactions to the very dangerous augmentations, which was basically biochemical injections that were to make these Spartans better and faster on a physical level in pretty much every way. But right off the bat during this process, 26 Spartans didn't make it, which was about 30% of the 75 candidates. Now, I don't think there's any real information about those that didn't make it, but if there is, I won't be covering it here. I want to focus on the ones that survived, at least as far as the augmentations go. Kirk-018 was a genetically and physically gifted person, and he did great as a trainee, up until the augmentations, which under the procedure, his skeleton became disfigured, and his case was actually so bad that he had to be suspended in a neutral buoyancy gel tank and breathe through a respirator. And Halsey mentioned that there was a way to fix him in her journal, but that's the last we hear of it. It seems like he is still alive in Halo lore, and the case is pretty much exactly the same for Reen-081, except for the fact that he was assigned to desk duty at Oni, like many of these failed Spartans. Now to Saren-019, you might recognize her from Spartan Ops. She was trained alongside Master Chief and did well, and they actually interacted quite a bit as kids, but until the procedure came in, her body rejected the chemicals, and she was basically later taken into custody and fixed up and trained in the commander program, and was actually left to think dead by the other Spartan 2s, and she would later become the commander-in-chief at Oni, and grew a special kind of hatred for her mother of the program, Dr. Halsey, and was later responsible for sending the order out to Palmer to kill Dr. Halsey, which ended in Halsey losing her arm. As far as we know, Saren Osman is alive and well in Halo Infinite. We also have Soren-066, which was disfigured by the augmentation process and assigned desk duty. What's special about him is how he reacted to this. He grew bitter, frustrated against the UNSC and his system. He felt cheated. Eventually, convinced by Patch, a technician, he attempted to escape and actually got into a physical fight with Randall, another Spartan 2, which we'll talk about later, but managed to subdue him with a tranquilizer dart. And they managed to escape the UNSC compound on a long sword, only to be shot down moments later, and Soren, being the sole survivor, actually managed to escape the crash and into the Forest of Reach, and to come in conflict with Master Chief several years later as a full-blown insurrectionist. But the current status of Soren as of 2559 is unknown. Spartan 2 Cassandra-075 was crippled by the augmentation process, but not her spirit. She was reassigned to commanding and was salvageable. She, like many Spartan 2s, were actually good friends with Master Chief, and shortly after Halo 1's story, she actually reached out to him saying her rehabilitation is going well and promised to contact Chief again in the future. But not much else is known about her or her status currently. Fahad had a very bad reaction to the augmentations that in the later processes, the neuro complications actually gave him Parkinson's, and he'd later be assigned to desk duty at Oni. There's also Musa, who failed the process and was forced into a wheelchair, but did accumulate a grudge towards Oni and Dr. Halsey, but at the same time understood that the Spartans were a necessary thing to win in the Human Covenant War. So he actually grandfathered the Spartan IV program, and he went on to get June, the last surviving member of Noble Team, to go around and recruit big familiar names like Sarah Palmer, Thomas, and even Edward Buck, and later even got Fireteam Osiris with Flock to hunt down Master Chief and Blue Team in Halo 5. Yeah, it was an ex-Spartan 2 that did that set this all up. And we have one more augmentation failure to mention, Spartan 073, which was a nameless Spartan but seen in the scan trailer, and I thought this one was interesting. I know I said I want to mention any of these, but yeah, here you go. Here's another Spartan that we know about that failed. So in total, about 40 Spartans managed to pass the augmentation, and like we will learn in just a moment, some would rebel, some would escape, or even later die or be captured. But I actually forgot to mention this special case of a few mysterious Spartan candidates that we know nothing about, which include the call signs of 116, 118, 119, 121, 123, and 124. It's probably because of the closeness of Chief's call sign that these were just not talked about at all in Halo lore and may always remain a mystery. And whether these Spartans survived the augmentation process and even survived the Human Covenant War is just unknown. But there's also other Spartans that we talk about soon that were never really properly identified. And there's also the case of Class 2 Spartans, which was the second batch of Spartan 2s. But with the introduction of the Spartan 3 program and other logistical issues, Halsey determined that the second batch was inferior to Class 1. And I won't really talk about Class 2 because we already have so much stuff to discuss. So now let's talk about the successful augmented Spartan 2s. So firstly, I want to talk about Ralph 103, Daisy 023, and Joseph 12, and also a couple other Spartans, one being Oscar 129 and another unnamed Spartan. So they, of course, all had successful augmentations, but they didn't want to be Spartans. They rebelled against the UNSC, took some hostage, and demanded Halsey let them leave. And they did. Their mission was to, for some of them, revisit their family. Ralph revisited his own Flash clone, which was ill and freaked out and killed him. Daisy also had a similar experience revisiting her clone, but didn't kill her clone. But eventually, him and Daisy were captured and brought back to Reach. But due to Ralph's psychological condition, he was discharged and adopted by a family to live basically a normal life. Although he would return to combat as a Marine, still augmented, however, most of his, quote, upgrades diminished, and he eventually got killed by a fuel rod projectile while fighting Coveys. And the other Spartans, including Oscar, used small arms to actually kill themselves. And police officials in New Houston actually found Oscar's body, which confused locals, but his body was eventually recovered. The whole thing was covered up by Oni until a conspiracy theorist, Mashak Mordati, discovered the police record years later. But Daisy, having already escaped and went back to her family, continued on being a cooperative Spartan too. Now with the closure of her clone and life as a Spartan, she went on to complete Operation Silent Storm, but also went to hunt down an enemy leader, however was reprimanded by Sergeant Johnson and Master Chief and subordinated to Chief. And although the timeline is a little bit fuzzy here, Daisy eventually did get shot down and her body was later found by Master Chief. Now let's talk about James 005. So like most, he was gifted and worked alongside Chief in Blue Team with Fahad, Linda, Sam, and John during the Wilderness mission as children, as seen in HaloFollower Reach. As a kid, he had a run-in with Tango Team who beat him badly, but he didn't break spirit. And once the Covenant introduced themselves with Harvest, James deployed with the rest of the Spartan 2s to get their new Monier armor. And later on, during the fight on Sigma, shortly before the invasion of Reach, James was Blue 4 in Blue Team working with Chief, Kelly, and Fred. And the Battle of Sigma Octanius 4 took place in July 2552, and the Spartans were assigned to assist Red and Green Team in the city. James' arm was burnt badly by the Hunter's fuel rod, although he did live here. It was about a month later during the last days of Reach that 24 Spartan 2s were gathered to be briefed for Operation Red Flag, which basically was an Oni plan to capture a Covenant hierarch to negotiate peace with humanity. But that never went through because of the invasion on Reach. But now with a massive invasion moving in on Reach, that plan, Operation Red Flag, never went through. James with Master Chief and Linda went on a mission to destroy a navigation crystal that, if found, would give location of all of humanity's colony. And during this mission, James had had a needle strike in his jetpack and sent him hurling away from Gamma Station and was never recovered. There is some chance he is alive and landed perhaps in the oceans of Reach, but it's all very unlikely he did. So now let's talk about the classic blue team, which of course includes John 117, Fred 104, Kelly 087, and Linda 085. Now I'm not going to tell you their life story, but obviously these Spartans are alive and there are missing team members here. But basically, to summarize, blue team and all the Spartans in it, Master Chief worked alongside many different Spartans, and for many different operations, Spartans would rotate in and out, like James, for example. But Chief recognized these Spartans, including Samuel 034, as his family. And shortly after the destruction of Harvest, the first colony attacked by the Covenant, Sam was injured and stayed behind to destroy a Covenant ship. This was heartbreaking to Chief because Sam was like his brother. There's also James, but as said earlier, he died on Reach's invasion. Blue team, consisting of the team in Halo 5, ran anti-insurrectionist ops before together, even at some points being subdued together. But once the war started, Blue team ran many operations all over the galaxy fighting the Covenant in all very bizarre situations, which eventually led into the fall of Reach, where the team worked together to take down the navigation crystal in a facility with Sergeant Johnson, where Fred was reassigned by Master Chief to lead Red Team on the surface of Reach to defend the Mac generator facility on Reach's surface. But their Pelican got shot down and right off the bat killed 4 Spartan IIs, including Malcolm 059. Malcolm didn't really stand out much as a Spartan II. He had pretty much the same upbringing as most of them, but he did serve under Green Team led by Kurt 051, and it was around this time that Joshua 029 also died in the conflict as well. Fred, along with several other Spartan IIs, would defend the facility on Reach, and it was during this time that the UNSC Majestic was ordered to bombard, firing 6 MAC rounds down on the ground. However, in doing so, all of Team Beta would be wiped out. Probably 6 Spartan IIs total, but only 2 are confirmed to be, including Spartans known as Red 15 and Beta Red Actual. Not much is known about them, and there's very little chance that the others survived as well. It was around this time that Joshua, with Fred and Kelly, would, on Banshees, try to destroy a Covey landing zone. However, Joshua's Banshee took hits, and he ended up passing in a nuclear explosion. The facility would eventually be overrun, and they would fall back to Castle Base with Will and others like with Fred and Kelly. It was several days later that they discover a Foreigner complex underground and fight through waves of Covenant. And Vinh 030 and Isaac 039 dropped their charges and potentially blew up. It's likely that they were wiped out, but they could have survived inside Reach's mines, but ultimately that's the last we know of them. They very likely perished. Another Spartan team, Team Gamma, was led by Anton 044, which had Lee and Grace, and was sent to rescue Admiral Whitcomb. However, like Fred and Will, they ended up being unsuccessful in escaping Reach, however, did survive for the time being. Meanwhile, during Fall of Reach, Blue Team, consisting of James, Linda, and Chief, boarded the Circumference to destroy the navigation crystal. They were successful, but it ended with Linda being shot, and in critical condition, Master Chief, once back on the Pillar of Autumn, quickly put Linda in cryo, and a couple weeks later, during Halo 1, when the Pillar of Autumn became under attack, shot out the cryo chamber before crashing on Installation 04, so essentially Linda was gravely injured, but was floating in space safe for the time being, and was eventually recovered by John shortly after the end of Halo 1 in the Longsword Fighter, and soon after, they captured the Covenant ship known as the Ascendiant Justice. Chief and Sergeant Johnson, with Linda's body, went back to Reach, recovered Halsey, Fred, Will, and Grace. However, during this time, Covenant elites that had hidden on the Ascendiant Justice revealed themselves and killed Anton and Lee 008 during their escape and were hit by stray plasma bolts. Soon after, Operation First Strike was set ago, and the Spartans that survived, Master Chief, Fred, Linda, Grace, and Will, would sneak aboard a massive Covenant fueling station and actually successfully killed 1 to 3 million Covenant and up to 488 Covenant vessels destroyed, delaying the invasion of Earth. However, it was during this event that Grace would actually get attacked by the Brute Guards, and with her being struck down, John activated Grace's fail-safe detonation and blew up all the Covenant around her. Will 043 would go on to fight on Earth, aiding Fred and Linda and Antarctica, and deployed to Cuba, and then requested to go to the foreign planet known as Onyx. Will, along with Kurt, Kelly, Mendez, Halsey, and the Spartan IIIs, would go on to fight Coveys and Foreigner Sentinels. When they were trying to escape in a certain situation, Will actually confronted two hunters without a weapon and attacked one, ripping the worm straight out of his armor. This kind of surprised the Covenant, but moments later, the Bond brothers shot Will with the fuel rod cannon and he quickly died. Meanwhile, Master Chief would go through the events of Halo 2 and 3, why Blue Team was mostly active on Onyx and doing their own things. So stepping away from that story, let's talk about Maria-062 that had a very interesting tie-in with Halo 2 and the Master Chief. Hours before the invasion of Earth, Maria would actually test out the new Mark 6 Monier armor with ODSTs in United Korea. It was then quickly delivered to Kario Station for Master Chief to put on. And the thing that's so unique about Maria is that she was still active sort of as a Spartan II, testing gear and doing other kind of half-physical things, but I guess that she was pretty flawed at this point, being too injured to continue active combat with the Covenant, which would explain why she passively did test and testing armor, but wasn't in combat. And she's the only Spartan II known to have retired. So real quick break here, guys. I wanted to talk about today's sponsor, Audible. They're offering all Halo followers a free 30-day free trial membership. Just go down to the link in the description, audibletrial.com/HaloFollower, and get a free book. I recommend getting a Halo audiobook, of course, and I recommend Halo Evolutions. It's an anthology and has some really bizarre, interesting stories into it. Learning about Halo lore while driving to work or school is such a great way to invest yourself more in Halo, and also a great way to support me here on HaloFollower, so check it out, link in the description. Now let's talk about Red Team, which like most Spartan teams were formed by several different Spartans, but let's talk about the most obvious and recognizable, which is Jerome-092, Douglas-042, and Alice-130 as seen in Halo Wars. Now these Spartans really stand out as they were all sort of failures in the augmentation process, but unlike the others, they were able to make full recoveries, go through the process again, and be successful and go on to fight as intended, even if a little bit weaker than most Spartan 2s. Not much is known about them on an individual basis, but we do know that they helped save Anders. Upon the Shield World in Halo Wars 1, the crew would save her, destroy the Covenant forces and the planet, and then go into Cryo, why of course being interrupted by the Flood. Almost a Dead Space situation happened there. But about 28 years later, the team would officially all awaken together and confront the Banished on the Ark, Halo Wars 2, where Red Team of course would be whooped by Atriox. However, by the end of the story, the Spartans were alive and active, and likely regrouped with the Infinity and Halo Infinite's timeline to enter in a massive war between the Banished and surviving UNSC forces. Next up, we have Omega Team, which worked alongside Red Team quite a bit. These guys are super underrated. It's three beefy, very powerful, very cool looking Spartan 2s, which included August-099, Robert-025, and Leon-011. They worked closely with Red Team during the Battle of Arcadia, but not much is known about their individual lives other than that they fought alongside the Spirit of Fire, even seen briefly in the cutscenes, and carry some unique weapons for Spartan 2s, and did indeed survive the war, still active as of 2558. Jerome had actually confirmed this in Halo Wars 2, discovering that his old friends in fact did survive the Human Covenant War. Now let's get to J006 and Grey Team, which in my opinion is by far the coolest story of the Spartan 2 program. Essentially, J006, he hated the Spartan 2 program, and as a kid he attempted several attempts to escape with Adrena 111 to leave the Reach compound. Eventually, he would get a meeting with Dr. Halsey, who gave him the option actually to leave the program under one condition: his memory would be wiped, and potentially a side effect would be his entire life. And this made Jay wanted to stay because he, I think, had a crush on Adriana, but basically he did befriend her and didn't want to lose her or memories of her. So that night, Jay and Adriana attempted one last escape, but only ended with Jay convincing Adriana to return to the Spartan life. The two would be introduced to Michael 120, who also, like them, was a troublemaker, and these three would become Grey Team, which, unlike most teams, were very detached from the chain of command and deeply enjoyed fighting in their own style. But later on, as adults, Grey Team would be ordered to fight in a battle of the rubble, where they looked for targets of opportunity, and Jay would attempt to kill Thel Vadam, later known as the Arbiter in like the Halo games. However, both would escape alive. By 2551, Jay and Grey Gray Team were deemed too inaccessible to be reassigned to Reach for potentially the fall of Reach, as they had literally been out of contact for a year by UNSC and ONI, but this wasn't very unusual. However, before the end of the Human Covenant War, something very strange and unique happened to Gray Team. They were captured by the Covenant Fleetmaster and put into stasis. Years later, in 2558, a covert operation was given to someone named Melody Aziki to find and free Gray Team. But that's the last we know of Gray Team, that they're essentially in cryo somewhere adrift in maybe space or maybe some ex-Covenant faction. Ultimately, their status, whether they're alive or not, is unknown, but certainly a very interesting thing left with a big cliffhanger. We don't know what happened to them. This other story is super fascinating too. Naomi-010 in the Kilo 5 story is just so cool. Naomi, like Gray Team, was a problem in the beginning. She temporarily escaped as a kid, but got caught. And her father, Stefan, when he found the Flash clone that was supposed to trick him and other people into being his actual daughter, well, he just wasn't buying it. He sensed that that was not his daughter that was getting sick all of a sudden and acted so strange. So he started a 30-year search for his daughter and to find the truth. Now, not much is known about Naomi during the Human Covenant War, but the bulk of her story takes place in the Kilo 5 trilogy after the Covenant War, shortly after it. So essentially, she joined the highly secretive team of Kilo 5, which consisted of 3 ODSTs, a couple specialists, and her, and also Saren Osman as the commander, and a cryptic Oni AI named Black Box. And their mission was to incite insurrectionism among Sinkili factions after the Great Schism to essentially cause conflict within the elite society and not become a superpower. And basically, she had run-ins with Jumadamas faction and other adventures happened. But interestingly enough, Naomi, along with the rest of Kilo 5 and Blue Team, attended the Void Memorial, where they pronounced Chief as MIA, and many, understandably, assumed that Master Chief passed away. But Naomi and Kilo 5 went on to complete missions on Sinkilios covertly, and later came to realize that her father had been searching for her since she was a little girl and taken by Oni. Granted by Saren Osman, the head of Oni, they were actually allowed to talk, and it was truly heartbreaking after 30 years. I actually made a whole video about Naomi's tragic story here, and I think it's definitely worth a watch if you haven't heard about it already. Link down in the description below. Next, we of course have to cover Black Team, which was composed of Margaret 053, Roma 143, Otto 031, and Victor 101. A highlight of the missions together involved the raid on Verge that was all about cutting off the blockading of Tribute's invasion, where they ran into non-hostile, although psychotic and crazy drones that were essentially slaves to Covenant mining operations. So sort of like a mental hospital, but they were all slaves. And eventually they released them to all escape and cause chaos. But later, Black Team was also assigned to cut off another supply route, Operation Blowback. This would result in them being attacked by foreigner machines known as Gatherers that captured Margaret for essentially cataloging and study. The foreigner monitor, Ebullient Prism, hacked into Victor and Roma's HUDs and tricked them into attacking each other. Eventually, Black Team successfully saved Margaret and killed the monitor and managed to actually instantly wipe out a Covenant fleet. Later in 2557, after the end of Halo 4, the Your Didact was essentially sent slipspaced across the galaxy, and eventually Black Team would run into his body, but surprise, he wasn't dead, and he was furious at the sight of more Spartans, and he brutally wiped them all out. Now to Cal 141. She didn't have any unique upbringing, basically did everything that Master Chief and the other Spartan 2s did with no problem. So really her only lore lies in what we saw in Halo Legends, that her and 4 ODSTs went on to assassinate a minor prophet. She'd actually saved one of the ODSTs, but unfortunately was hit across the head by a chieftain's gravity hammer, and despite being a Spartan 2 with Monir armor on, it was a fatal blow. This is really just a testament to how vicious and powerful brutes are. There's also George-052, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with and might be wondering why he's on this list. Well, he stood out for a few reasons, being the only Spartan 2 on Noble Team, but also as a heavy weapon specialist during his career. Not much is known about him besides his time shortly before and during Reach, but as he went on to join Noble Team, it was the Battle of Fumarole that his friend Tom, the original Noble 6, would end up blowing up, as seen in the trailer, and this deeply affected him. And beginning July 24th, 2552, the Fall of Reach would begin, and George would join Six to invade and destroy the Long Night of Solace via a slip space device. George stayed behind and very likely died in the slip space jump. There is like a 0.0% chance he survived, but it's super unlikely. Randall-037 had easily the most humbling story of all the Spartan IIs. He was a good loyal soldier and didn't really fight much with his upbringing. He even caught Soren-066 trying to defect, although of course, as I said earlier, he got shot by a tranquilizer dart. But during the Battle of Vodin, Randall was essentially in space fighting the Covenant and fell from space down to the surface of the planet and only survived by landing in the ocean. It was 3 days later that he was rescued by locals. But Randall made a crucial decision here. He decided to go by Aiken and start a new life as a civilian, leaving his entire Spartan and military life behind. It was about a decade later that finally Oni tracked him down and wanted him to come back as a Spartan II. After all, he was a huge investment to the military. But when he refused, Oni wanted to, quote, decommission him. And we all know what that means, right? Well, eventually they agreed to reverse many of his augmentations instead. And it's no surprise that he hated Oni. He'd eventually be recruited by Locke, though, and board the Alpha Shard. Most of them would be picked off by Legolo worms, but Randall would stay behind to detonate the Havoc nuke and destroy everything, basically. There's also the case of a few other Spartans that were briefly seen in Halo lore, like Arthur-079. He was seen in Halo Legends The Package, but not much is known about him besides him helping Blue Team, including Solomon-069, Kelly, Fred, and John to save Dr. Halsey, who had at the time been captured during the Battle of Meridem. Arthur died getting crushed between two battle cruisers while providing cover to Kelly. There's also Solomon, who was a part of this episode and group, serving alongside Green Team with Kurt-051. He and 11 other Spartans organized to board and capture the Covey frigate Radiant Arrow through deployment of a Prowler. And in 2544, during the package, Solomon also passed as he was trying to help free Halsey, but at the cost of his life, where he fell for a trap and got caught in an antimatter charge. There's also Sheila-065. She has very little info about her, but we do know that she acted as Dr. Halsey's bodyguard, and in 2544, they came under a Covenant assault boarding the evacuation craft, and Sheila ended up dying, determined to ensure the safety of just one human civilian, which honestly is a bit humbling to hear. So far, we've covered pretty much everything we know about the Spartan IIs, but there are some others I left out, such as Vinok-134, which will debut in Halo's TV show as, quote, Master Chief's deputy. So I think he will have great importance to the story, but also Master Chief. There's also Kai-125, which again has next to no information about, except for that Kai will also appear in the TV show and has been casted and has been described as courageous, curious, and deadly. There's also Kichi-047, which aided in the Harvest campaign. However, very little is known about him, and whether he's alive or not is unknown, as he's listed as MIA, and no one genuinely knows if he is lost or went AWOL, still alive, or dead. There was also one Spartan candidate, Caleb-095, but was never abducted as he wasn't in the expected location. This is kind of a unique thing that I decided to throw in here. And lastly, there was Riz. She's a new Spartan character, Spartan II, and of course, very little lore behind her, as she will make an appearance in the TV show and is described as focused, professional, and of course, deadly. Guys and gals, be sure to snag yourself that free Halo audiobook. It's a quick sign up, link down in the description. So guys, which story did you find the most interesting, and did you learn anything new? And if you did, be sure to smash that like button, because effectively it boosts the video up the YouTube algorithm through Halo results and gets it out to other Halo fans. So every like really actually does help my content and help support me a lot. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to let me know what other things you would like to see in future content down in the comment section below, and be sure to follow us on Facebook. Alistair is over there, always posting great posts about Halo. If you're on Facebook a lot, it might be useful to catch up with some Halo news, and check me out on Twitter. I'll catch you guys in the next one soon. Peace.